I'm Katie McRobert from the Australian Farm Institute, for those who are unaware. It's the only agricultural policy think tank in Australia. So, we're here today, as you can see, to talk about food security and supply chains. Exports, of course, make up more than 70% of the value of agricultural production in Australia. Two-way trade is around half of our GDP in Australia. The National Defence Statement recently released said that rising tensions and risks of military escalation are a grave concern for Australia in our region. We all know that our infrastructure in Australia leaves much to be desired, particularly in the agricultural sector. And none of us are unaware of the background of COVID, of the ridiculous situation of the Ever Given Suez Canal fiasco, of what's happening in the Ukraine. And if you're not thinking about food security and supply chains as front of mind every day, it's probably only because it's such a wicked problem that it's really hard for us all to take in. So who better to take us through this very complex topic than John Blackburn, who's the former Deputy Chief of the RAAF. He's Chair of the Institute of Integrated Economic Research. He's a Fellow of the Royal Society of New South Wales, the Institute for Regional Security, the Sir Richard Williams Foundation, the Australian Institute of Energy, and of course is co-founder of the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group. So John's got a bit of information to share with us, and then we're going to have a few questions between ourselves, but I'm sure that there are plenty from the audience. Start parking those now, because we have plenty of time afterwards for us to interrogate John about what he's going to show us this afternoon. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Katie. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the invitation to speak to you. Why would somebody with 4 decades in the military be talking about food security and agriculture? I'll explain that, but one of the real sort of triggers for me is when I heard David Littleproud announce during the pandemic that we don't have a food security problem because we produce 3 times as much food as we consume, so there's no issue at all. Now, I can understand the need to calm people when we're in the mid of trying to hoard toilet rolls in the shops. And there's a need to calm them down, but I have spent an hour with David Littleproud, and that really got up my nose, because what it does, it glosses over a very complex issue and says, don't you worry about that, for political reasons. And we need to be worried about it, because we all need to be active in getting these issues addressed, because they're not being addressed rapidly enough at the political level, for a whole bunch of reasons. So let's just have a talk about, what I'm going to say is why am I concerned, and this is way beyond the sector of agriculture, a little bit about national security and resilience, talk about some implications, I think, for your sector, and then at the end, what should we do collectively? What a wonderful decade it's been. Climate change, everything saw down the south coast, the pandemic, or this particular one, supply chain disruptions, the economic crisis as it's emerging, partly triggered by the pandemic, but also the underlying economic conditions globally. An energy transition, which is frankly not supported by any coherent risk analysis, strategy or plan. It's happening, but that is a huge risk for us as a nation. Add on top of that conflict, and that cascaded through everything. Again, whether it's global food supplies or it's the economic issues, supply chain disruptions. So we're seeing a significant problem with chaos. We generally wait to react to these sorts of issues when they go wrong, like the pandemic, because we didn't prepare for it, and then we congratulate ourselves on how good we are at reacting. Wasn't that great? The underlying problems, particularly in the pandemic, and we've done a lot of work on health security as well, were never communicated to the public, because again, there was a real important need not to panic people. But if you actually look at our resilience during the pandemic, it was frightening what was going on behind the scenes. That's where we are today. Now let's start to look forward, and we've got politicians, and particularly Americans, saying we could be at war with China this decade. But don't you worry about that, because we've committed to $365 billion for nuclear submarines that are unlikely to arrive in my lifetime. We really are kidding ourselves, because I've got to tell you, if we end up in a global conflict between China and America, none of us win. We all lose regardless of what the outcome is. But we need to understand those risks and not pretend that some nuke sub's going to solve the problem for us. The last couple of years, I've led a national resilience project. Some of you, Gabby, for example, has been participating in that. We had about 250 people involved, domain experts from around the country. And what we were doing is trying to understand what are the risks that we face and how resilient are we as a nation? Because the word resilience has been used a lot in the pandemic. Remember, we had a mining camp in the Northern Territory that then became I think it was an immigration centre. It then became the Centre for National Resilience. What lunacy. And this goes on everywhere. Everything has to be resilient and sovereign. I'll come to that in a minute. So what we did, we tried to have a look, understand what's happening in the energy sector. What's happening with sovereign industry capabilities, the economy, university research. What happens to the research in this country? Now, only about 5% of the research done in Australia ever ends up in Australian industry. The rest gets exported. A bit like digging up iron ore and exporting it, not doing any value added. We looked at the health sector, and that's what really frightened us. So we had everyone from ICU specialists to pharmaceuticals to hospital people to the AMA involved. With all these aspects, we were going through and trying to understand where do we what our risks are. We wanted to look at agriculture, not just because of Little Proud, how critical it was, but we run all this pro bono. And so you have to have project leads for each of those areas who have time. And we had two sequentially for agriculture, but in the end, they didn't have time with their day jobs to actually do it. So we went off and did a few things ourselves to have a look at this. So with all those areas, the other one which I didn't mention there was climate. We ran that in a parallel think tank, the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group, because there's so much emotion, politics and bullshit around it that we didn't want to distract the serious discussion we had to have about all these other areas, like energy and economy and health. But we bring all those together. We submitted some stuff on our climate work, so we've done a series of reports, but the last one that we put out in June 22 is Food Fight, Climate Change, Food Crises and Regional Insecurity. And 2 points I'll put out of the report, this is all online, 2 points I'll raise that we're concerned about that we went to government with. Firstly, our capacity as Australia to assess the national and regional vulnerabilities and to understand the consequences of what could happen is completely inadequate. We wait for something to happen and then do something about it to the best of our ability. But the other point we raised here is that we need to think about how to enhance the capacity of our neighbours, Indonesia, New Guinea, these other countries, to withstand climate change-driven food shocks and their security consequences, as well as some of the other things I'll talk about, potential supply chain problems. Because what we should be trying to do is use our food production capability, agriculture, not just for our own food security or from the economic benefits of exporting, or as Barnaby says, let's go to the high-end value exports. We need to think seriously how we use our production potential to stabilise our neighbours, such as Indonesia, in the event of their food crisis, and the projections for their food production as a result of climate change alone are not good. So do you want 260 million people sitting in the north of you who end up like happened in the Middle East when they had food crisis, but that nation falling apart? No, you don't. So what we argue is that the agriculture sector is not just about producing food for us and the economic benefit. You are critical to the security of the region if we can think about how production here could support our neighbours in a crisis. So it's not just about money or Australian food. You're as important as defence, because if you can help stabilise our neighbours, that's going to help us a hell of a lot down the line. So out of this couple of years doing this, a couple of simple conclusions we came to. The pandemic has exposed a global lack of resilience, so not just us, around the world, by a collective failure to assess and act on national risks and vulnerabilities. At the start of the pandemic, we had 25% less hospital beds than the OECD average. We had 2,000 ICU units. We import 90% of our medicines with no clear ability to understand where they're coming from. About, I think, 80% of the APIs come from China. So we didn't understand our vulnerabilities, hadn't done about it. There were lots of announcements in the pandemic. Don't worry, we've got all these respirators, they're being produced in Australia. When they were delivered to the hospitals, the hospital pharmacists were telling us they had something like 2 or 3 days supply of intubation medicine. So when you ventilate someone, it's a good idea to give them anaesthetic and knock them out. Those drugs, they only had 2 or 3 days supply. Things were that tight. The Victorian Department of Health said to the Victorian government, February 2020, looking at what's coming at us with the pandemic, our hospital system will collapse. Which is probably why you can see how Dan reacted as he did. The Ukraine war has highlighted the risks of being energy dependent on a potential adversary and of naive assumptions. Who would have thought this could happen? And the dependence on Russia for energy in Europe was absolutely crazy. But just have a think. We import 90% of our medicines. We import 90% of our fuels. In 2018, 25% of all our refined jet fuel that we import came from China. 40% of our trains with them. Now, this is the adversary that we're now arguing we have to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to deter. whilst meantime we're getting more and more dependent. That's as stupid as what's happened in Europe. And it's a global problem. So what we think is we're ill-prepared as a nation for the growing range of risks that we face, and this will impact our national security and resilience because we're so busy preparing for stuff. Reacting to stuff, we don't have time to prepare. Now, I'll get to the agriculture bit in a second, but let's step back a bit. There is no national security strategy in Australia. There isn't one. We had one in 2013 under the Gillard government. Abbott threw it out, along with a lot of other things. There is no national resilience strategy. I think we had one about 2011. There's no national energy security assessment. The last one was done in 2011. So is it a surprise that if we don't understand the risks in the energy sector, that we don't have a coherent strategy and plan? We sort of do bits of it and hope it works. A national risk assessment, thankfully, was started last October in Home Affairs. And our group's involved with a lot of others in working through some of those issues with the Home Affairs Department and with DQ, particularly on the climate change. That's a great start. But the international risk assessment was done for the Defence Strategic Review by Office of National Intelligence on Climate, was classified. And the government still refuses to release it. There are only 66 words describing what the climate risk is inside the Defence Strategic Review. 66 words, which basically is very bad, but don't come to defence, we're going to be busy doing other things. The domestic climate risk assessment may have a preliminary one by the end of this year, but most likely not in any detail till the end of next year. And we did suggest to DQ that you don't chuck it to a consulting company, try and build it yourself, but Deloitte's is in there. There's no health risk assessment, 12 or 13 different studies. There's no economy risk assessment. And I was looking in the agricultural sector and was trying to understand what's happening about risk. So I found the National Farmers Federation with a report, a proposal there about financial risk, talking about what farmers needed to do to address it. And that's fine, but it doesn't address the bigger picture of agricultural risk. The only report I've been able to find, and I've used extensively, about our food supply chain was a report on the Ag Department's website written by Stephen Bardos in 2012. It's a really good report. I used that as the basis for then arguing why we had to have fuel security, because look how just in time the food supply is. Nothing's been updated since 2012. The world has changed a bit. Now, Katie did point out to me the other day, and I didn't know it, about the House Standing Committee on Agriculture commencing an inquiry into food security in Australia in October 22. I thought it was pretty great. The climate group I'm a part of did make a submission. It's going to look at national production, consumption and export of food, look at fuel, fertiliser and labour and their impact on production costs, the availability or impact of supply chain distribution on the cost and availability of food. It doesn't sound like it's writ large. And the potential opportunities for threats to climate change to food production in Australia. A good start, possibly not enough. What we've argued, looking at all this, we have to have that national risk assessment done really quickly. Then we have to have a national security strategy and resilience strategy. It's pretty basic stuff, because what we're going to have to do is prepare for what's coming. And it is going to get more complex, particularly with this issue going on about China and the region. We're going to have to prepare for what's coming. We're going to have to be able to better react to it, not just make it up on the fly. We're going to have to be serious about adapting to changing conditions, because no matter what we do with emissions, the next couple of decades are already predetermined. It's going to get really ugly. Where feasible, we try to prevent disasters. Because if we have that information, and what I did say when I met with Albanese is, be honest with the Australian people. They're not stupid. Tell them what the reality is. Stop the spin about, don't worry about that. We've got 3 times more food than we eat ourselves. Be honest with them, because on that basis, we need to be able to mobilise our society to prepare for and then deal with what's coming at us. The last time that I'm aware that we mobilised our society was Essington Lewis just before World War II. And we're in a worse position industrially now than we were then. So let's just talk about the agricultural bit there. Now, my whole farming experience is the back end of a cow in my brother-in-law's dairy. Didn't achieve that much, but he got a lot of laughs out of what I was trying to do. So he was a dairy and dry farming in Victoria. So think about agriculture and supply chains, and the immediate things around that we should be talking about. Fuels and AdBlue, fertilisers, farm machinery, costs, chemicals, logistics, workforce. Fuels has been my hobby horse for a decade right now. Let's have a look at where we stand in this little area here. 20 years ago, 60% of our transport fuels were imported, but we have 40% of our own. Today, it's over 90%. 10 years ago, we had 7 refineries. We were down to 4 by 2015. I had many discussions, some of them yelling with Angus Taylor about this is getting ridiculous. The government took some steps, but too late, so only 2 refineries remained. Their subsidy contracts go through to 2027 with an option to extend to 2030. In 2015, the Department of Energy, I think it was Resources and Tourism as it was then, wonderful combination, said they weren't worried about the refineries disappearing because, you know, it's cheaper to import refined fuel. Now, before I offend any, are there economists in the room? Okay. I then understood, as, 4 decades in the military, and I didn't understand a lot of things outside of that when I started this, but I then realised that economists are completely bloody clueless about the real world. You seriously want no refineries because it's cheaper to import refined fuel? China is in the process of building up a supply chain right down to the origin and creating massive refining capacity, and it will undercut the market. So if you take a pure economist view, our import dependencies, which were going up prior to the pandemic, will continue to go up. Are we happy with that? Because, by the way, we'd like to get our military ready to go and deter you. Could you send us some fuel before we go? So we could end up with no refineries. We can't let that happen. And the previous government's movement to do this was minimal. This government has done nothing visible to change this in the last 12 months that they've been in power. And we'll certainly run a campaign on that. AdBlue, I'm sure you're all aware of that. When China stops high-grade urea exports rapidly, we had real problems. Were we going to keep the diesel logistics system running? Steps were taken for Incitec to produce stuff up in Brisbane, but I understand that factory was scheduled to close last December. I haven't seen any information saying it stayed open. There was talk about having 5 weeks' worth of stocks. But when you look at that sort of supply chain and vulnerabilities of who produces at the starting end, yep, producing through renewables and urea in the future are great, but we've got a gap now. Same problem with fertilisers when I discuss with people in the industry about the just-in-time nature of deliveries and the sources of some key fertilising components from China and West Sahara. Again, really good places to be reliant upon. Farm machinery, workforce. I was listening to the Regional Australia Institute talk at the press club this week about significant problems of getting workforce out there. You're not getting a workforce out there if you haven't got the infrastructure, as they pointed out, which is housing and medical services and everything else in rural areas. And if we don't address that, this ain't going to work. Because you're not going to produce much crops in the city. Logistics. Our logistics systems are very good at managing just in time. But we have a problem where we can't move rail efficiently across the country. So I was in a meeting with 2 rail companies, 2 of the trucking companies, and Maritime Industries Australia. And what they pointed out was that the rail industry, say east to west and back and forth, was being undercut by foreign-owned shipping on the coast. So it was making it less economical. That rail, they said, is very difficult to move freight up and down the east coast going through the cities in Sydney because it's all managed differently, you're not getting priorities. And the truckers said to me, look, we've got an ageing workforce. It is physically impossible for us to meet the logistics demand projected using trucks. It's not going to work. But is anybody sitting across and going, what the hell are we going to do and how do we manage this? You can't outsource the whole lot to overseas. Chemicals. So West Australia now has closed its last refinery, has the most oil of any state, can't process any of it. What else gets imported there? But it's okay, we'll put the nuclear submarines there. Now, let's go a little bit further out. The themes that we were pushing right throughout the pandemic to committees and governments, look, we'll talk about sovereign capability, but let's work out where do we have to have it? And by that I mean you either own or control capabilities in Australia. Now, people say, oh, there's no risk of letting the Chinese lease the Port of Darwin because we could resume it. That's a bit simplistic. What do we actually have to have? And for everything else, because we're still going to be part of a significant global supply chain, although less and less on China eventually, how do we get trusted supply chains? And by that I mean transparent and verifiable. So if something's critical to our functions as society, do not trade in that particular area with a country you can't trust. In 2019, the US Congress Commission looked at their medicine supply chains. We get fairly relaxed because although you can't find the source of our medicines on any box in Australia, you can find more about dog food, I think, because the TGA and the industry says, oh, it's confidential. We don't know where this stuff's coming from. The Americans do. And they said that their dependence upon China for generic medicines and APIs was a national security risk. We were fairly relaxed because when I spoke to government areas, they said, "Oh, it's okay, most of our medicines come from America." And I went, do you understand where America gets it from? Doesn't matter, it comes from America. So, we've got to think this thing seriously, and we're going to have to invest in this area because otherwise we'll continually get caught out by our own stupidity. Now, let's talk about a few things around this side of energy. Nothing works without that. And the energy transition is incredibly complex. It will take decades. We're not all going to be driving electric cars by 2030. We're into our second electric car. Love them. Got solar on the roof. But let's get real about this. We're going to need fossil fuels for ages. Hopefully some of those are sustainable and things like that. But this energy transition is one of the most complex things, and it is not being done properly. If we don't have that, your industry stops. And you're not all going to be driving electric tractors, I don't think. Let's have a look at cyber attacks, what we're seeing happening to the large-scale farming in the US. Infrastructure. How do we get across the country? How do we get up and down the country? And we see what a cyclone does. Intentional interruption in any of those supply chains are terrible. We've lost the ability of moving fuel on rail. All the rolling stock's gone except for the mines. So we move it by truck. So we're building this huge, Americans are building this huge fuel storage in Darwin just for the war. And I met with somebody the other day and said, how are you going to distribute this stuff? Well, there's no one agreed to put a pipeline from the port to the Air Force Base. And if you want to move fuel down to our main fighter base in the Northern Territory at Katherine, you've got to do it on a truck on a 2-lane road. Gee, that's good, isn't it? You actually can't get fuel to our northern bases right across there at a higher level of operation. It just doesn't work. We just about ran West Australia Drive jet fuel during the search and rescue operation for MH370. Remember that, 2014 or so? We ran them dry fuel. Who thinks we could actually do anything up there? And so when you look at the infrastructure coming down to your sector, it's incredibly fragile. And it's not just roads and rails, it's housing, it's hospitals, it's all the systems that we're going to need out in rural areas to make this work. Ports and shipping. Shipping. In 2018, we had 34 ships 2,000 tonnes above on the Australian register or owned. Only 4 of which were capable of international trade, LNG tankers, and I think the company that wants to get rid of them anyway. Switzerland, who doesn't have a coastline, has more registered ships than we do. We have no control over our shipping. Yet China has, I think, 5,500 ships, either flagged or actually owned. So here's the scenario, and it's Utopia. I don't know if you watched the Utopia series on TV a couple of years ago. So we're going to get submarines to go up and protect our sea lines of communication from China attacking them. But we're buying stuff from China that's coming to us, and the ships that are bringing it to us are most likely Chinese. Is there a bit of a logical disconnect in here somewhere? If you can't have any control or influence over your shipping, we've lost it. In Finland, from our research, they mandate 40% of the shipping that they depend upon has to be nationally flagged. 40%. Other countries, I think, have particular regulations. The US and Vietnam. Your coastal shipping has to be nationally flagged, and the crews on board, for security reasons, have to be there. Just have a look who's doing our coastal shipping. Occasionally, when you see people running aground on the reef and causing huge damage, it's not ours. Ports is the other problem. Darwin, at least the Chinese. China's got a huge ownership in Newcastle Port. Now, I'm not having to go at the Chinese people. I'm saying, if we consider they're a serious threat, what are we doing? Because, again, if you haven't got ports or shipping access and guaranteed, what are you going to do? Economy. We're seeing perturbations and global problems accelerated in some cases by the pandemic. But the institutes I've been involved in the last few years have been looking at what does that next financial crisis look like? Our public debt, whilst high, is not high comparative to other countries, but we have regularly been first or second highest in the world with private debt. We are going to be facing significant economic headwinds. Now, we need to actually say, well, there's a risk, what do we do? Things with risk analysis, there's a risk of not doing something, and then there's a huge risk of doing something. But we have to have the conversation. The economy is not going to go back at what it was. If we look at the scale of corrections, GDP losses, we'd probably survive those, but a lot of our neighbours wouldn't. And if our neighbours don't, then we've got chaos. And climate. Your sector knows more than a lot of people what the impacts are it's going. I was down at the VFF seminar last year, which is why I was invited here, and listening to farming community and the analysis saying this is what's happening, these are the changes. And again, we just got to be realistic about it and say, well, what do we do to prepare? Not sort of panic at the time when things are wrong. So what is a resilient society? What I did is I looked at characteristics of a military that tries to become resilient, and in each of our workshops that we did, we applied these 3 characteristics, said, do they apply to health or energy sector or any other area? And there's 3 things that we think are important. Number 1 is shared awareness, shared purpose. Be able to be honest with ourselves about what the risks are, where we stand, where the limitations are, and communicate it. Because we won't get large-scale action if you can't convince Australians and industry and the community that there's a problem here that we've got to fix. Basics. You don't do that by saying, don't worry about food supply because we produce 3 times as much as we eat. You have to be teamed. There's nothing that we can do either in a military or here in our society without that proper teaming between governments at all levels, community and industry. And so our federation structure is a hell of a challenge for us. Some of the stupidity we saw in the pandemic, like Queensland hospitals are just for Queenslanders, don't come across the border. We've got to understand that the structure the British gave us does have some limitations in the modern world and have a conversation on what the hell we're going to do about it. Because we will not be able to address the risk coming at us, of which agriculture is one, unless we work out how to work together. And finally, the important thing is we're going to have to prepare for this and be ready to mobilise. It's very difficult to do that. I'll just now tell you the title of our report. So all those bits we did, we produced reports, but people don't read much reports, so there's one consolidated report. Here is the title we chose. Australia, a complacent nation. Our reactions are too little, too late, and too short-sighted. We've got an idea of why we ended up that, which I'm happy to discuss in questions, if we don't face reality. So what can we do about these things? Well, again, the conclusions I had in the whole thing is we don't need an AI program to tell us that we've been strategically stupid. It's fairly obvious. Whilst this is grim, I'm strangely optimistic. So I don't get depressed by what we're doing because the actions that we need to take as a society are certainly not beyond our means to do it. We have a lot of resources if we stop just selling them off overseas to foreign companies to make money on them. And we have a lot of experts and expertise in this country. There's one thing that's been missing. Leadership. And a political system that's 3 years focused. We're apolitical in our group. We think both sides are causing us problems. But if we don't collectively as a community and within the agricultural sector say, hang on, enough, what is the risk assessment? Tell me what the assessment of this here for energy for our sector, and say of our politicians, and have a discussion with the industry, stop the spin. Let's be honest with ourselves and do a risk assessment, but don't give it to a consulting company. Let's work on this together. The more people that say that will change the dynamics, and the next time that somebody like Little Proud says, don't worry about this, it's all fine, we do this, go, oh, bullshit. Let's be honest with ourselves. So with that cheery message, happy to take any questions.
Thank you, John. Very eye-opening. I've got a couple of things to start us off, but if you start thinking of your questions, there is a microphone that we're going to run around the room as well. And when you get handed the microphone to ask your question, if you could just say who you are and what organisation you're representing today before you launch in, that would be helpful for us. So, John, I probably know the answer to this one already, a bit of a softball to start us off, but we know that fed people are content people. We can see that from this room here. We know where we're going with this. Hungry people are angry people. Now, you talked about regional security and agriculture's place in that. How worried are you? How urgent do you think this situation is?
Oh, we should have started a long time ago. Again, if you read the science and have a look at it, what could happen in Indonesia as you get problems of salinity in the coastal waters? That country is for those, I'm sure quite a few have been there, the political and structure across that nation has its fragilities, if I can say, on how it's put together. But it's important that it stays coherent. If you start to get areas where they're running into food shortages, and just see what happened, in Egypt and in the Middle East of these things, it's all be chaos. And the Border Patrol and a couple of Navy ships sitting up there going, turn back or we'll send you to Manus Island, is not going to work. You're talking about large-scale people movements. We spend a lot of time in Europe each year and in Italy, and you see the masses of migration coming out of North Africa and the Middle East. It's overwhelming the place. Imagine what would happen if Indonesia had a problem feeding its people. And I'm not saying this is the Indonesian military coming down here and doing these other fantasy scenarios so we can justify more submarines. This is about movement of people who are in desperate situations. Why wouldn't we think about using our resources now and work out how the heaven's name we're going to stabilise it? So I'm worried about it because we're too complacent.
And following on from that, of course, the global economy runs on a system of debt, and that's not just about our financial structures, but it's really a system by which we codify our obligations to build relationships around the world. So what can Australia change about the way it has debt obligations with our neighbours to improve our resilience and security? Is there a place in the knowledge economy for agriculture to participate?
Don't know enough in that specific area, but what I will say is that where it comes back to it starts is, well, what's the economic risk we are facing? The risk you talk about debt, the one that worries me is credit. Mm-hmm. I met a really interesting lady who works at the War Memorial whose PhD was in failure of credit at the start of World War One. Now, narrow topic, it's interesting. There was a failure of credit at the beginning of World War One, but the Allied powers had discussed it, worked out what they would do in the event of a credit failure. Just think about if we had a credit failure, because credit's largely a Ponzi scheme, what happens? All the ships, they're bought on credit, the bunkering oil's paid for on credit, and the goods they're moving are on credit. If you have a credit failure of a shipping line, the ships get arrested by the creditors. That's happened a few times to the big shipping lines. So the thing I'm worried about there is what happens because we've got exponentially growing debt across the world, only kept alive with credit. The think tanks that have been looking at this said, if you have a failure of that, the only way you deal with is global action. Do you reckon the G7 or the G20 could agree on anything within a couple of weeks to do something? No. So that's what worries me. Yes, debt levels are a problem. That issue is beyond my experience or thinking in there. But credit failure, watch how quickly it goes. And again, these questions need to be in a risk assessment. But I don't know of any economic risk assessment we've ever done.
I don't want to hog the microphone, and I think I saw hands going up before. So, well, I'm not going to pick my boss first. We're going to send the microphone over this way, George. Okay, Gabby, first up, and then over to table 3.
Thanks for that, John. It was very refreshing.
Not depressing.
Yeah, Gabby Chan from Guardian Australia. One of the things that you come up against when you talk about how systems work and how the political and economic system fits together is people say what you're advocating is to go back to a kind of protection system. You're talking about protecting, maybe putting tariffs, maybe subsidies. What do you say to that argument that comes up every time you say maybe we need some capability in some of these areas?
The cost of not doing is what we don't actually take into account. You're going to see a lot of reshoring or other changes to supply chains as particularly America realises its vulnerabilities and starts to bring stuff back on board. You'll be seeing that happening in Europe as well. So it's not just us, other countries are going to do it. So we need to say with them, what are the ways of doing this without putting up tariff and other barriers? You are still going to have significant international trade, but if it's just a pair of thongs or a T-shirt, I don't care. But if it's something critical, what's that trusted supply chain? And how you make that agreement to do it, it's complicated. But the alternative of just keep going with, look, the market will take care of everything, it's just too expensive because we can see what happens when things fail. So I'm not saying I've got the answer there, but what I want to make sure is that Australians, we understand what the question is we've got to address because there's a risk. And the political system, I can understand the things. Imagine if you came out with a national risk assessment as a politician, the first thing the press would go and do, depending which party you were, what are you going to do about it? Well, the answer in a lot of cases is we don't know. Very difficult for a politician to go, I don't know. But that's what we need.
Now, there are a couple of questions on table 3. This lady was first, and then you can pass it to the person next to you. Then we're going to come back to table 6 and then go over to table 4. Trying to traffic manage these. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you for your presentation. It was very insightful. I'm Helen Dalton, a member for Murray, and along with being a politician, first and foremost, I'm a farmer, so I'm quite interested in what you've got to say. Your presentation didn't include water, and that is a big issue, given that there's more than 10% of our water is owned by foreign interests, of which the Chinese government
Yep.
too, which is a real risk, and we're for sale. I think that we need a national conversation about all of that, and I have certainly been pushing for a water register in New South Wales, just so that we are aware of what's going on. But why is it that you have deleted water from your presentation? Because 2/3 of the world's food is produced under irrigation.
Yep.
And the other question I have, or statement, is the fuel reserve. And we've almost seen that where we've come to a standstill. We can't get diesel for our tractors. It's been very, very close. I think we've got less than a week, and there's a motion with New South Wales farmers, Peter Arkell's here, from the Griffith branch, talking about a fuel reserve. That should be paramount, because it wouldn't take much, really, to hold this country to a standstill. 5 days would do it.
So in the water, no, I didn't delete from here. I'm just put some examples up. We did discuss the water when we started doing the agriculture area study that we couldn't do because we couldn't get people to do it. And some of the things we talked about was what you talked about, the management, the sale of it. But the other one is, let's have a think about exports. What's the water content of our exports and products? And is that something, for example, we're happy to have a foreign company buy up a whole bunch of dairies, utilise a bunch of water and then export the product for themselves, that's fine. But we don't seem to have a long-term plan of what we're going to do about it. I agree with you, it's absolutely critical, but it wasn't intentional left out. These are just little examples because there's a lot more stuff in there. On the fuel side, this wasn't set up, I just happened to have this.
Here's something we prepared earlier.
Now, I'll build it all up and then I'll tell you what's happening. This top line here is a thing called the International Energy Agency 90-day net imports requirement. Down the bottom here is the actual number of usable days of diesel we've had in the country. Doesn't change much, does it? And back here in 2014, there was a problem in Victoria Refinery. Within a couple of days, we ran in Gippsland and Western Victoria. My brother-in-law and a bunch of other farmers up in the northern part near Echuca were saying, right, it's crop time, what are we going to do about this? Do we get our utes, put tanks in the back and go to New South Wales and try and get something? I asked the industry sources, why was it down here? What I was told was that companies that say American-owned were running a financial year and you run your stocks down at the end of the financial year balance, just having to coincide with the cropping time. So this is the reality of where we've been. Now, this up here, and net imports days, you would have heard Angus Taylor, it's not a problem, we've got 80-something days. Net imports is an accounting figure which is about releasing stock to the market in the event of a crisis. The 3-day stocks that the previous government said we had deep in a cavern in America, they were sold off last year in the middle of the energy pricing crisis for the very reason they're there. But what you've got is governments talking about this 90 days and 80 and back here, and the best imagination, Angus decided that he was going to add in the fuel that is on ships coming to Australia or under contract, which the IEA says you're not allowed to do because you can only count stocks in the country. The other problem with this figure is it includes the oil we produce off the northwest shelf as a part of our calculation, but no Australian refinery can process it because it's light sweet crude. So all that is accounting rubbish. You can't drive a tractor on accounting data. That's what matters. But when we had 12 days, we ran out within 2 or 3. So it tells you something about we don't understand. The interim liquid fuel security report that came out in 2018, from these are other inquiries are going on, said in the middle of 2018, we do not have a coherent model of the fuel supply chain to understand how it works. And that was the Department of Energy. The final report came out, I think, at the end of 2019. Angus Taylor refused to release it because he said it was classified. So I agree with you. This is a serious problem. We are going to have to look at how we give ourselves assured supply chain of critical parts of energy, which this is, and forget the accounting data. But on water, I fully agree with you. Yeah, it's a huge one.
Thanks, John. One more from table 3, Gary.
Gary Goucher, freelance economist.
I did ask.
In defence, I'd probably blame the accountants rather than the economists. My question is in 2 parts. The problem that you've elucidated here really took 70 years to evolve from probably the end of the last war. So the first question is, how quickly do you think it can be turned around? The second part of the question is that part of what's happened in that 70 years is that the world has become vastly more integrated.
Yep.
And China is just as dependent on us as we are on them, not just as, but as, is highly dependent on what they import from us and the rest of the world. Doesn't that mean that we are a whole lot more secure than what a simplified assessment of what we can do at home here in Australia might suggest?
That's why I'm saying smart sovereignty. Where is it we do have to have it? It's not everything, and it's certainly not 100%. So we look at a series of scenarios, say, if you want our society to keep operating for X months, what is it we need to have control of here? Because it's not just about stocks, it's about flow of energy or other areas there. Look, I think if we stopped sending baby milk or iron ore to China, they'd probably survive for quite a long time. But if they stopped sending some things the other way or interrupted the supply chain, we'd have a much faster set of problems. That stock level there, you start to look across Stephen Bardos's report back in 2012 about food supply chain, and you look at how tight it is. A perturbation in there is going to give us a problem quite quickly. So with what's going on globally, particularly with China emerging, mutual interdependence is not working. It's not going to happen. So what we've got to do, and I think what the Americans and other countries are doing, is how do they build some capacity in their countries. Now, we need to tie into them. So there's no way we could afford to try and rebuild some of these things we're building for this time. So we've got to work out who can we actually build a trusted relationship with. But again, let's not forget what happened in the pandemic with medicines, masks, PPE, and all the nasty little games going on by some of those countries that we think we trust behind the scenes to divert resources. So we've got to work out where do we have to have something ourselves, and it's not everything. In fact, it's a very small percentage. Who can we trust, and what are we going to do about it? In a sense of timing, it will only happen when there's a proper public discussion. Now, most of you here remember Senator Jim Molan. Jim and I were pretty close through our military careers and afterwards. And Jim died recently from prostate cancer. In recent years, we've been working behind the scenes with Jim about, okay, how do we get this national security strategy going? Because that's a starting point. But your risk assessment strategy, let's have a talk about this, because it will take a long time to address. Jim was told twice by Morrison's office to stop raising the topic in public because it was not an election issue. And Jim was stunned, he told me that. So, if that's the machinery happening inside the parties, and oh, by the way, in that whole period, Labor didn't say a word about national security strategy because they were just shadowing Liberals every minute of the day. It's going to take us in public. It's going to take organisations such as this to start saying, hang on, I've got some important questions here. I want to know about this. You can do that to drive either Senate or joint parliamentary inquiries. You can do that with the media. But we've all got to forget the quiet Australian rubbish. We've got to get more vocal. And I'll also say is that in the demographic in this room, you folks need to get more vocal, because you're going to wear, the younger generation, you're going to wear the results of what us lot have done in the last couple of decades. I think we, the older generation, also have a responsibility to look out for these folks coming along. And, you know, let's not be quiet Australians. Let's say what we think. It's not good enough. It doesn't take too many people to get right up the nose as some of the ministers. We need to do that. We need to make them feel a little uncomfortable that they're not looking after us as a nation. Now, don't get me wrong, some very good politicians, I'll acknowledge that. But there are some complete idiots. Oh, thank God for that. Thank God for that. I mean, there's some great ones. I mean, I used to really enjoy Twinner Wacker Williams. He was just carried. But not Barnaby. But what we've got to do is stand up. But here's the questions. Why are we complacent? Have a think about it. I've lived in a lot of countries around the world. You know, I was a migrant when I was 9. It's why are we complacent? We don't have a shared narrative in this country of fighting for our survival. The Americans do. India does because what the Brits did to them. China does because what the Western world did to them. Most of Asia has a narrative of having to fight to survive. Africa does. South America does. We don't. We were given federation. We've had it pretty good because of the resources base and everything else. We occasionally send people off to fight for either the Brits or the Americans. Yeah, Japan was coming down through the chain. But our generation, and particularly with our current cultural mix, migrant mix, we don't have any shared story of how Australia has had to fight for to maintain its independence and sovereignty. Because it's been really good. Well, I've got to tell you, with the risk we're facing it, that is going to cause us a huge problem. So without scaremongering, we've got to say it's time to speak up and it's time to face reality. Because geography and being so far away from other parts is not going to help us in the future, the way things are going. Anyway, that was a cheery thought.
Thanks, John. Probably last couple of questions. We're going to go to Richard on table 6, and you can pass that back to JP when you're done.
Richard Heath, Australian Farm Institute. I'm not an economist, but I'm going to ask an economic question.
I'm not an economist either.
So there are plenty of economic organisations and some European countries that in balancing the risks of climate change and food security are now advocating for no or low growth economies. Is that a legitimate response?
I think they have to discuss it. There's people talking about degrowth. And certainly some of the people I deal with in the think tank space say that ain't going to happen. But how do we have a different economic model that's not about, everybody sort of goes back to years ago, whatever. We don't have a picture of what it could look like, but we need to discuss it. Because if you look at the vector of growing international debts, the growing costs of extraordinary extraction, so the fundamentals in there, the cost of energy transition globally, that is going to be massive as we go through this. What are we going to do? Keep running debt up? When does the Ponzi scheme collapse? If it collapses, it can collapse very quickly. So the other institute, which was the original Institute for Integrated Economic Research in Europe, full of economists and funded, not like ours, they were doing these scenarios of what it could look like, and it could turn very, very quickly. Just watch the nervousness in some of the commentators in the US. If they default on the debt, all these other things happen. We've got to have the conversation, but if we get a bit idealistic, we're all going to, no, it's not going to happen. This is going to be a horrible compromise for all of us. And it's going to be difficult. But I would say, from what I'm seeing in our view, the older generation here is probably the richest one that we're going to have in Australia. Because you just look at the circumstance we're in. It's not working for the younger generations. It's not working for a whole bunch of other things. We're going to have to do something a bit different. But again, Australia by itself can't do it globally.
Okay, we're going to go to JP's question because we are well and truly over time, and George has got them one more behind the pillar that I didn't quite see. Pete.
Sure. JP Van Wart from ASL Allen, also an economics consulting firm.
You didn't put your hand up when I asked.
I thought what you've done is you've given an elegant reframing of what Donald Horne said in 1965. So every 10 years as a nation, we point out that we face these chronic risks that have potential to become acute. I'm not interested about the role of government in this. We're moving into a more interventionist phase. That's very clear. Yeah. What role does the supply chain to take responsibility for the rents it generates for itself? Because everything I ever hear is about government has got to solve it. We understand the farmer's dilemma in being at the bottom of the supply chain. But if these supply chains are making all of this money and they're all connected, how can they lead rather than us saying the government's going to do it for us?
Are they foreign owned or Australian owned?
Well, the answer is they're both.
Okay, so when we triggered a Senate inquiry in 2015 on fuel security, the Australian Institute of Petroleum stood up and said, fuel security is not a national security issue. The market can fix it. 3 out of the 4 remaining oil and fuel companies are foreign owned. Ampol's Australian. Okay. Who thinks that you can hand a national security responsibility to a foreign owned company? And that's what we've been doing. Supply chains. If we create the market regulations, conditions or whatever, then we need to actually drive the market in a direction. I look at what the Norwegians did with their energy. So I think Statoil, when it started up, they've got a bunch of government people to go and understand the industry. They actually had government investment and ownership of a large part of their oil industry, and now it's into renewables. They took a role to actually ensure that they had a certain amount of resilience and control in there. I think in the last decade or so, we've said, so it's neoliberal, we'll hand to the markets. Why would a foreign company or any of these large, huge corporations give a rat's about our security or resilience? It's not in their interest. So I'm not arguing we go back to the days where government owns everything and does it, but we're going to have to look at a different model of regulation or control or guidance or investment in the right areas, because as it stands right now, would you trust some of these foreign fuel companies to look after our security? They close down refineries because it's cheaper to refine it over in Asia, where you don't have the regulations or the workforce costs or everything else, they don't give a rat's about our resilience, but neither did the department then. So I think we're going to have a different model, but it's not back to the Department of Work side of things. It's going to have to be something different. But let's at least have the conversation. But what I've heard for the last 9 years of my arguments with the Liberal government was all the neoliberal stuff. Now, most of my life I was a Liberal voter, defence very conservative. But as I got older and started to look at things, I went, what the hell? And then started to understand where the waste was, I went, enough. I'm not on the left. I'm right in the centre politically, because I think both parties have let us down. So that's the conversation that we need to have. And it will require regulational change, no doubt. But the alternative is really ugly. And unfortunately, I've got some people my age and older going, well, I won't be alive then. Not a good excuse. Last one behind the
Right,
bill.
last question, Pete.
Yeah, thank you, Katie, and thank you, Evas Marshall, Pete Aqua, New South Wales Farmers. Look, I live in an electorate here in Sydney that has spoken up, and our electorate voted teal at the federal election. And look, I think reality's biting. I heard last night a fellow parent at my child's school has had to give up their outsourced dog walker to walk their own dog. So I guess when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals globally, obviously we're going okay in most of the 15, but a couple we're not going so well in are in food security, obviously. And we sit here in Australia at the moment looking at the basin plan that might take a further 30% of water out of our productive pool to grow food or fuel stock. We look at the safeguards mechanism that will drive a lot of farmland back into scrub or forests, without disparaging my friends in forests. We see a sustainable and prosperous industry that has been feeding our neighbours in our live sheep exports being shut down because they've lost their social licence. I'm just interested in your view on what's going to shake us out to reflect on some of these decisions and look at what truly balanced growth looks like that manages a range of risks and a range of priorities, be they emissions, environment, regional security, so on.
I don't think we'll get at the two major parties any significant shift until there's such a crisis that it becomes a disaster. And I'm not talking about just a bushfire. It can, if the global economy goes where it possibly could go, then they'll do it. What we argue is let's prepare for that. So when the thing does go tits up, we're like, ooh, what do we do? We'll shut the borders and we won't let people go out the house. We need to prepare for that circumstance, which as a small self-funded think tank is all we can do. And the community has the same view. I don't think our federal political system's fit for purpose anymore. It can't look at the connections or complex areas. You have a department for this and a department for that. Henry Ford would be really proud of our government structure. But who looks across how they connect? Well, PM&C doesn't. They're doing a shorter term issue. So I think we will hit major failure points. There'll be a crisis. But if we prepare ourselves to how we do it, if you have credit failure, you can't make it up on the fly. There's a lot of stuff that I've read from economists. I'm not an economist. You can't make it up on the fly. You've got to prepare for these things and say, what the hell would I do? The other thing is that the sort of things you see happening is the narrative that you tell out there is going to be important. And I was just with Engineers Australia last week. Engineers are very, very important people, but they can't communicate with the public because of engineers. Same thing in this sector. It's true, but you need to be able to tell the story to the public that this is what's happening in the sector, this is what it looks like, and then have the case, oh, you want to make these decisions, that's great, but here's what the impact is and the cost. I mean, look, as I said, I love my electric car, but this idea that we're all going to be driving electric vehicles up in 2030s, it's fantasy. And then you've got the hydrogen lobby fighting the battery lobby fighting someone else. It's nuts. So we need to say, look, this is how the system works right now. If we do these steps, here's the cost of doing it to our society and way of being. And oh, by the way, look where rural Australia's already going. So it's being able to tell that story to the public to change the opinions, change the views. What we've tried to do in some areas is certainly support the Teals as far as talking about climate change and the information they could have, because there are groups of who think, whilst we don't want to end up like Italy with 50 small parties in the government, what we want to do is make the two major parties uncomfortable. And you do that through independence, as long as it doesn't get out of control. But we're going to have to do that. The party machinery, I understand why it's there, but in talking to politicians I trust inside the system, they often get very frustrated because they can't follow what they know they need to do because you've got to follow the machine. I understand it's a system. As Australians, we've got to ask, is that what we want? And if you don't want it, then become part of that community discussion and change it. And that's why we're supporting the TILs. They're not the end solution to a complex government system, but it might be enough of a holy cow moment to stop these characters just sitting where they are. Both parties, I reckon, are broken in some ways, though. Anyway, I wish you all luck.
And on that final note, John, we are well and truly over time, but before you give up the microphone altogether, if you can, in 60 seconds, this is your biggest challenge of the day, within 60 seconds, and I know Anne's looking at me going, good luck on that. What's your ask of the people in this room in relation to these questions?
Stand up, become part of the conversation as a group. Don't let, for example, Victorian Farmers Federation tried to do that and the AFR stamped them down. Become part of the conversation. Say, let's be honest with ourselves. Where are we today? What are the risks we face? So and then we can have a conversation about where we go. That's the most important thing. Don't be passive. It's easy enough to me to say where I don't have a 40-hour-week job. But as a community, we've got to be more active. Let's be honest about where we are.
Thank you.